Hannah Donnert with the Collaborative on Health and the Environment. Che enjoys bringing you the latest environmental health science through our partnerships, calls, webinars, science serves, publications, and social media. I would like to welcome everyone to today's Che EDC Strategies Partnership webinar, which is titled The Monsanto Papers. Our moderator is Jerry Heindel, founder and director of Commonweal's Healthy Environment and Endocrine Disruptor Strategies, or known as HEEDS. I want to mention too that if you go to our webpage, under the slides and resources, you'll find a discount code using the word webinar, all capitals, if you'd like to purchase this book for a 30% discount. We will leave time following the presentation and conversation between our moderator and speaker for a brief Q&A session. You may type in questions to the Q&A feature available on the menu bar at the top of your window at any point during the presentation. After the panel discussion, our moderator will read out questions for our speaker to respond to. We'll get to as many comments and questions as we can during the Q&A period. For those of you who called in on the phone, we have posted slides to accompany today's webinar on our website. You can download these by going to healthandenvironment.org. Please scroll to the bottom of the page and select today's webinar. On the webinar page is a link to the slides. Everyone on the webinar right now is muted with the exception of our moderator and our speaker. This webinar is scheduled to last for 45 minutes and is being recorded for our call and webinar archive. With that, I'll turn things over to you, Jerry.
Okay, thank you very much, Hannah, and welcome everybody to today's webinar. We're very privileged to have as our speaker today, Carey Gillam. Carey is an investigative journalist who spent more than 20 years reporting on health and environmental impacts of the agrochemical industry, including 17 years working for Reuters news agency. Her 2017 award-winning book about Monsanto won the Rachel Carson Book Award from the Society of Environmental Journalists. Based on her work, Monsanto has attempted to silence her, but the evidence she discovered or uncovered is so powerful that she's been asked to speak all over the world to share her findings, including talking to the European Parliament in Brussels and the World Forum for Democracy in France. She now works as a researcher for the nonprofit US Right to Know and is a news contributor to The Guardian. Today, she's going to discuss her new book, The Monsanto Papers, Deadly Secrets, Corporate Corruption, and One Man's Search for Justice. We're going to organize the webinar into two parts. The first, where Carey will talk about herself and her new book, and then I'll ask a few questions followed by questions from all of the attendees. So I'd like to start out by asking Carey to tell us a little personal information about herself before she moves into her slide presentation. So can you tell us a little bit about where you came from, your background, how you got into investigative reporting and how that led to all this focus on Monsanto? And then after that, you go ahead and turn right into your presentation.
Sure. All right. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, perfect.
Yep. Okay, great. Yeah, so I've been a journalist, as you explained. I've been a journalist for a very long time, more than 30 years, actually. And it was in 1998 that Reuters, the international news agency, asked me to move to Kansas City and start covering the agricultural beat. There was a company named Monsanto, not too far down the road in St. Louis, that was had just introduced genetically engineered crops. And these crops were designed to be glyphosate tolerant, to be sprayed directly with glyphosate, and they wouldn't be harmed, but the weeds in the field would die. And this was really revolutionizing agriculture, changing farmer practices in the fields, and other companies were getting involved, licensing traits. And so it was my job to cover not only Monsanto and agricultural stories generally, but DuPont and Dow and Syngenta, BASF, and the others. And I've spent a lot of time since 1998 until now, with farmers and academics and scientists and you know, just grain handlers. Have walked through hundreds and hundreds of farm fields over many, many years, and you know, spent a lot of time really digging deep into this industry and this beat. And this is what led me, I guess, to my book, Whitewash, my first book, which came out in 2017, and then this latest book. But I have to say, you know, when I first moved to Kansas City, I've been covering the banking beat, and I thought the agricultural beat would be boring, and I guess I wasn't very excited about it. I thought, you know, how important could that actually be? But I've really come to believe that this is our most, you know, agriculture and food, how our food is grown, is the most important industry. It affects everything so directly, the health of our families and the health of our environment. So I feel very honored to be writing about that and learning and researching and sharing what I know. And I have to say, though, the work that I've done, this research, these 20 years, all the time with farmers and scientists and academics, and learning what I have about our regulatory system and the health effects of this pesticide-dependent food system that we have sort of embraced. It really makes me, you know, fearful for my children and my children's children and their children's children. And that, you know, this is why I call this a conversation about accountability. I think we are all accountable and required to provide the healthiest path forward for our children and our future generations. And I think we're on the wrong path right now. So I hope that my work in a certain respect, a little bit, hopefully, will help illuminate the correct path. So let me see if I can get my slideshow going here. Whoops. I just want to touch, before I get into the book, I want to touch on some statistics I think are important and meaningful. Cancer is one disease, one health problem that we know is tied to pesticides in certain respects. Cancer has become far too common in our country and in our world. I'm sure many of your viewers, hopefully attending this webinar, know someone in your family or friends who've had cancer. It's touched my own life. My father died from cancer a few months ago. My husband has just been diagnosed with cancer. I lost a good friend a few years ago from cancer. All of us are touched by this to a degree. 39.5% of men and women now in the United States are expected to be diagnosed with cancer in their lifetimes. And this is according to the National Cancer Institute. I find that a staggering statistic. I think we all, you know, we're getting used to it. We're getting accustomed to it. We see ads for things that, you know, drugs and treatments and chopping off body parts. And we're told we can live with cancer. I think we need to live without cancer. I think we need to not get used to it, not get accustomed to it. You see the other numbers here. Over 600,000 people in the US died last year from cancer, more than 1.8 million newly diagnosed. Pediatric cancers are on the rise in children under 5 years old. There are certain cancer rates increasing for leukemia, brain tumors, rare liver tumors. And even though, of course, there are many different causes, I don't want to certainly say that pesticides are the only cause for cancer, but they definitely are shown to be one causative factor in an array of cancers and other health problems as well. But you see here just a short list: non-Hodgkin lymphoma, prostate, liver, pancreatic, multiple myeloma. Researchers say certain pesticides are detrimental to children's brain development. Chlorpyrifos has been in the news for some time, and other neurotoxins that we, you know, routinely are exposed to through food and water and other exposures in our everyday life. And you know, these are hurting our children right now, and we need to be more cognitive and more engaged in protecting our young people and their development. And people always say, yeah, maybe those other folks are exposed to pesticides, but maybe not me. This research shows 90% of Americans have pesticides or their byproducts in their bodies. Human exposure to pesticides has become ubiquitous. I'm just going through these pretty quickly because I know we want to focus on the book. But I do think that this sort of information is contextually very important because this is the framework. This isn't, you know, this isn't about just one book and one chemical and one company. This is a much larger story that I'm hoping that my book, you know, tells. The United Nations on pesticides. Pesticides are a global human rights concern, UN experts say. And they've been urging that a new treaty, that new practices and policies, and that there be a new way of looking at pesticides in terms of our exposures. And again, you know, it's important to realize it's not just us people, it's the environment. You see more than 40% of insect species are declining, a third are endangered. Intensive agriculture, heavy use of pesticides is thought to be a very contributing factor to our plummeting insect numbers. And birds, you know, we're seeing a great loss of birds. Grassland, more than 700 million birds in the US is of the grassland species. In the agricultural areas of our country, we're losing these birds, and these are very instructive. Scientists tell us about what we're facing ourselves for our own human health and our future. So get into the subject matter, I guess, at present. So my first book, Whitewash, which came out in 2017, was really focused on Monsanto and glyphosate and the history of this chemical, which Monsanto was able to market and promote to become the most widely used herbicide in the world. And glyphosate, active ingredient in Roundup, Ranger Pro, other sort of brand names that people are probably familiar with. Glyphosate has a long history of use in agriculture, but also in use around school districts and parks and playgrounds and municipalities. And of course, consumers use it to spray around gardens and to try to keep their lawns neat. It's used on golf courses to keep the greens pretty. So this is a very widely used and ubiquitous pesticide. Researchers have found, with our U.S. Geological Survey, have found this in rainfall and air samples, as well as it's commonly found in food products, in water, and of course in human urine. Researchers have found that. So my first book was really about that science and that history and how Monsanto had worked to suppress a lot of that science. And that was based on, that book was based on a lot of freedom of information documents that I had obtained, records from a lot of state universities, secrets that Monsanto had tried to keep. My new book sort of builds on that and picks up with the litigation, the Roundup litigation that started to be filed in 2015. And one of the first people, the first person, one of the first people to file a lawsuit, and then the first person to actually go to trial against Monsanto, is the subject of this new book, the Monsanto Papers. Now, there were over 100,000 people in the US who have sued Monsanto, claiming that exposure to Roundup or other glyphosate-based herbicides caused them to develop non-Hodgkin lymphoma. All of these lawsuits are pretty similar. Some have been filed in state courts and federal court, but they all really got rolling in 2015 after the International Agency for Research on Cancer declared glyphosate to be a probable human carcinogen. But when I started to look at the litigation and to follow it, I really wanted to tell it through the eyes of one person and one plaintiff. And as I hope that you'll see in the book, Lee Johnson is a very special man. He is sort of the American story, pulled himself up by the bootstraps, had not the easiest childhood, worked his way into a really good job as a school groundskeeper, spraying pesticides and chemicals around, a large school district in California, and making a good living and taking care of his family and his wife and his two little boys. And he really wanted to be there and be a good father and a good provider. He didn't have his own father in his life when he was growing up. And so it was very important to him to be a good role model and be present for his own boys. And you follow him in the book as he's going to work and has an accident one day with a tank sprayer. He's exposed to an extraordinarily large amount of the glyphosate formulation, and later then becomes diagnosed with a terminal form of non-Hodgkin lymphoma, and learns, he's not going to be there to see his boys grow up. And so this follows Lee sort of through that journey throughout the book. You also meet in the book the lawyers that Lee connected with. And, I really found these people to be fascinating characters. And I found the whole mass tort situation itself to be such an interesting and compelling story. So the book really has many elements to it, but we examine Lee's journey with cancer and his struggle to survive. And we also look in the book at these different lawyers, Mike Miller and Brent Wisner and Dave Dickens and Amy Wagstaff, who are all very prominent plaintiffs' attorneys who make their living holding companies accountable for things that regulators do not hold them accountable for, dangerous products, medical devices that are defective. These are the people that put their own money and reputations on the line, and oftentimes are advancing millions and millions of their own dollars and putting years of work into litigation that they believe will hold corporate wrongdoers accountable. So you meet these people and you learn about their business in the book as well. And then we're going to get into some of the things that they found in the book. So as Mike Miller, who was the first attorney who was representing Lee Johnson, Mike Miller's firm did the discovery, the main discovery in the Roundup litigation, and were able to obtain millions of pages of internal Monsanto records. And these really formed the foundation for the litigation and the trials that were held. This is one of the first emails that they found. And I remember Mike Miller, when Monsanto turned over the discovery documents, they get dumped into sort of a digital database. And then they used artificial intelligence algorithms to dig up what they thought might be the most useful information for them. I remember that this was one that they found pretty compelling. And this is an email that Donna Farmer wrote. You see it's dated in 2003. She was a toxicologist for Monsanto, still is, works for Bayer, I believe still. And you see here, she says the terms glyphosate and Roundup cannot be used interchangeably. You cannot say Roundup is not a carcinogen. We have not done the necessary testing on the formulations to make that statement. There goes my phone. Anyway, so what this is revealing is not only, as many things, is not only that Monsanto, which has been saying for a long time that Roundup is perfectly safe. She's saying you can't really actually say that because we haven't done the testing. And this brought to light the fact, a very alarming fact for a lot of people, that our regulators don't require carcinogenicity testing. They don't require long-term testing on products like Roundup, on formulations. They require a lot of tests on the active ingredient, in this case, which is glyphosate, but they do not on the combination of substances, chemicals that are in the finished products, such as Roundup. That's the same is true in Europe. And this was something that Monsanto was able to exploit. And you see a lot of discussion of this in their documents. And you see that this was something that became particularly important in many ways. And this is described in the book. They hired an expert in the late 1990s because they were concerned that a lot of independent research was showing genotoxicity with their formulated products. And they hired an expert to help them try to defend glyphosate. Unfortunately, this expert agreed that it looked like these formulations could be genotoxic. And you see in the book how they got rid of that expert and never informed the regulators that he had that opinion or that he had thought that. And so this is sort of a rabbit hole that has a lot, a long path to follow throughout the book. I mentioned this earlier, the World Health Organization's declaration, classification that glyphosate was a probable human carcinogen with an association to non-Hodgkin lymphoma. And this announcement was made in March of 2015. And this is important because what we see in Monsanto's internal documents, again, and these were all laid out at trial and these are in the book, is that Monsanto made a lot of noise when this came out and said, these scientists are wrong. This is junk science. This is crazy. There's no evidence that this causes cancer. They're politically motivated. But what we see in the internal emails is that Monsanto, and these are dated 2014, I don't know if you can see, so well before the IARC announcement, Monsanto sees that this international agency is going to take a review of glyphosate scientific literature. They express how concerned they are. And they say we have vulnerability in the area of epidemiology, exposure, genotox. They're recognizing they're going to be examined by this international science agency, and they discuss how worried and vulnerable they are. Monsanto then even guessed, prepared for a probable human carcinogen rating, which is exactly what they got. They knew what the science said. They expected what the rating might be. And then they prepared a plan to discredit the scientist, to discredit the classification. And this is a lengthy document, but the essence of it was to orchestrate outcry with the IARC decision, was to mobilize sort of an army of independent voices that would support Monsanto's defense of glyphosate and discredit and try to invalidate the science that Monsanto knew was out there. A little bit about ghostwriting, if I'm not going to run out of time. This came up a lot at trial. This again was something, there were many, many examples in the internal Monsanto documents that I write about in my book of ghostwriting. But one of the more recent ones was when Monsanto wanted to, again, invalidate the IARC classification of glyphosate. And so what they came up with was a plan. We need to get some new papers into the literature, some new published papers. They need to be independent of us, and they need to refute the IARC classification. So they set about putting this plan in motion, and here they're discussing it. And you can see this is from Bill Heiden's. Did I have his name on there? Maybe I don't. Anyway, this is from Bill Heiden's, and he's a scientist at Monsanto, and he's saying, essentially, let's ghostwrite some papers. We'll do the writing. We'll get these independent scientists who'll edit and sign their names, so to speak. You see, we'll ghostwrite exposure and tox. Remember, that's how we handled William Crozen Monroe. Well, the William Crozen Monroe study from the year 2000, it's 2000, it says here 1999, but there it was published in 2000. It's sort of the foundational paper that has been Monsanto's defense of glyphosate throughout the world. This is a paper that has been cited hundreds and hundreds of times that regulators always look to and rely on because it was very comprehensive in saying that, boy, glyphosate doesn't cause anything. It's not a health risk, no effects on reproductive, fertility, non-carcinogenic. Man, this paper was the golden ticket for Monsanto to have regulatory approval and support around the world. And yet we learned from this email, Monsanto considered this to be ghostwritten. And there, even I talk about in the book as well, I mean, there are documents where Monsanto scientists are congratulating themselves for all of the work they did on this paper and how it's going to be such a great defense of glyphosate around the world because it's independent and it's so comprehensive. The hypocrisy in some of these emails is just stunning to me. This is just more where he's discussing, I've already written this, gone back, I've done this, showing all of the work that these scientists did on these so-called independent papers. And this is when it was finally published in September 2016, a review of the carcinogenic potential. The conclusion was that the data did not support IARC, this International Agency for Research on Cancer, conclusion that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. It directly refuted IARC, said that IARC was wrong. The title of this, 4 independent expert panels, and they went so far as to put a disclaimer on it that said neither any Monsanto company employee nor any attorneys reviewed any of the expert panel's manuscripts prior to submission to the journal, which the internal emails show was a complete falsehood. And this actually did go, when these emails came out, this went back to the publisher. They launched an investigation. The publisher actually wanted the papers retracted. The editor fought it, and they actually cleaned up the acknowledgments to reflect the fact of Monsanto's involvement. This is another example of ghostwriting. These came out again in documents. This shows that it's not just the scientific literature, but it's also sort of the multimedia. This was Forbes. This was an editorial that was published in Forbes magazine that we learned was ghostwritten by Monsanto. There are emails going back and forth with this professor describing the ghostwriting plan and how they could implement it. This is an in-house lawyer for Monsanto talking about the consulting group that they hired to write up op-eds and letters to the editors and things like that could talk about how safe and wonderful glyphosate was and how wrong these international cancer scientists were. And this consulting group could write them, and then they'd find people's names that they could put on them, and then place them in news outlets around the country. This one is not about glyphosate really, but this is just another example. Monsanto scientists talking about a paper. This was one he'd written about genetically engineered crops and livestock. He's written it and he's talking to his colleagues here. He's saying that it would look better if it was a non-Mon paper, not written by Monsanto. But he's concerned that faculty members may not want to just take something they did not produce and slap their names on it. He's having a hard time finding people who didn't write it to put their names on it and look like they wrote it. But all of this, there's so much of this that just illustrates, so much of this that illustrates Monsanto's, trying to get my timer there, Monsanto's efforts to be duplicitous. Questionable EPA interactions. There are many of those as well. I'll try to go through these kind of quickly. This is a situation with where the ATSDR, which is part of Health and Human Services, the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, was wanting to take a look at the toxicity of glyphosate at the same time that IARC, had come out, and they wanted to look at this. And they wanted to look at the formulations. Monsanto really did not want them to do that, and so they enlisted the help of some EPA officials to shut down or block or delay the ATSDR review. And you can see in this whole array of emails, and there are also text messages where they enlist these EPA officials, and the EPA officials jump to be helpful to Monsanto, and they actually are successful. This is just one email. Monsanto official is saying, Jess Rowland, who is an official at EPA, he's been in touch with him, and he says that Jess is relayed back, he will be helpful, he'll do what he can, and Jess says, if I can kill this, I should get a medal. So you see a lot of this sort of conversation that goes on in these emails and text messages. Jess Rowland, another one here about Jess. Jess will be retiring. He could be useful as we move forward with glyphosate defense. It's good to know that Jess Rowland was in charge of the cancer review of glyphosate at the EPA and was in charge of the paper that came out from the EPA finding that there was concluding that it was not likely that glyphosate was carcinogenic. Front groups, go through these kind of quickly. This is another tactic that we see in the internal documents that Monsanto has employed. funding organizations that look like they're independent of Monsanto, that look like, they are authoritative science groups or industry, agricultural groups or something not related to Monsanto. Because with these groups are coming out saying, the science shows glyphosate is safe, Monsanto feels that looks to be more credible than if they are saying it. One of my favorites is American Council on Science and Health. We have some really fun documents where Monsanto has been asked by ACSH for more money, and Monsanto is saying, well, you won't get a better value for your dollar than ACSH. And in these emails, ACSH lays out how helpful they are to Monsanto in their quest for more money, helpful in defending GMOs and glyphosate and attacking anyone, a journalist or scientist who may criticize that. These are a couple of the front group articles about me. They like to write about me. Carey Gillam is a liar. I'm also apparently involved in extortion. They also go after the New York Times, Eric Lipton, Danny Hakim, and one of our world-renowned scientists, Chris Portier, who helped run NIHS, National Toxicology Program for many, many years. When all of this, came in front of the judges, here's a couple quotes from the judges. You can see that a fair amount of evidence, the only thing Monsanto cared about was undermining the people who were raising concerns about whether Roundup caused cancer. Monsanto didn't seem concerned at all about getting to the truth. So, impede, discourage, or distort. And these are important. These are the judges' conclusions, but these, carried over into the jury verdicts that we saw in the 3 trials. So far, as I said earlier, 100,000 plaintiffs. All of them allege NHL. Their NHL was caused by exposure to glyphosate-based products, Roundup and others. 3 trials so far. Lee Johnson's was the very first. His resulted in a $289 million verdict. That has been reduced even more than here. Importantly, the jurors found Monsanto acted with malice in not warning of the risks of its herbicides. And all of this, as you're probably aware, it's been in the news. These 3 trials led Bayer, which bought Monsanto in 2018, to offer up $11 billion last year to try to settle the majority of these cases. So all of that is packed into this little book. I do hope, I've tried to tell it as a human interest story. As I said, it's, focuses on Lee and his journey through cancer and through this trial and the lawyers and the ins and outs. And there's just a lot of really crazy plot twists that happen. And I hope that people will find it enjoyable. And to read internal documents for yourself, you can go here, US Right to Know. We put all them up. I direct research here and gather documents to share with the public, and you can find them there.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a terrific overview. Let me just start by asking a couple of questions. I thought you did such a terrific job kind of personalizing everything. And, you used a lot of specific quotes from people, from the lawyers, from this guy, Lee Johnson and stuff. So how did you get all that kind of information?
Well, as I say this in the back of the book, I was either present for every conversation that I recount, in quotes, I was either present personally and witnessed it, or it's in a transcript somewhere, or on a recording somewhere. I didn't make up any of the conversations or try to recreate events in any way that were not locked down factual in terms of, a transcript or a record in some way. But I spent a lot of time covering this. I spent a lot of time with these people and traveled around the country with them, and really tried to get behind the scenes so that I could tell the story, in a unique way.
Yeah, it really showed in reading the book. The one thing that is kind of hard for me to comprehend is the kind of burden of proof in a trial like this, because it's still obvious in the literature with the IR is presumed carcinogen and the EPA not quite agreeing, and so the data is not so terribly strong in some areas, but yet the jurors sided with the defendants and they gave them a lot of money. So how does the jury look at data like that?
Yeah, well, and these trials all were pretty lengthy trials, and they comprised sort of two different sets of evidence. So there was the scientific evidence, which, as you said, is mixed, and so the plaintiff's attorneys would present the science that they best represented their case that non-Hodgkin lymphoma can be caused by exposure to these products, and the defense presented science that contradicted that, because of course there is science that contradicts that. Some of it which Monsanto has had its fingers in, but some of it that Monsanto apparently has not had its fingers in. But then they also looked at the evidence of deception and manipulation and tinkering with scientific literature, which is much more extensive than what we just touched on here today, and collusion with regulators and influence of regulators. And when the jury weighed it all, and then the personal factors for each individual plaintiff, they had to determine, is it more likely than not that this was a factor in causing this person's cancer. And unanimously, these juries did all decide that. And you have to talk to the juries, as I've done many of the jurors, but they were frankly outraged. A lot of them were just outraged by the levels of deception, and because I think it begs the question, if your product really doesn't cause cancer, if it really is safe, there should be no need for deception. There should be no need to manipulate research. So.
Okay, terrific. So what would you say is your kind of hope for this book, that the impact that it will make?
Many things, I guess. I mean, first of all, I just hope people enjoy it, and read it and are moved by Lee Johnson's story. I think he's, a very soulful, special person who's just going through an incredibly torturous type of cancer and is in pain every day. He was not expected to live this long, but he's hanging in there. He's, for his kids, he's trying to hang on as long as he can. And he's trying to use his energies to speak out about pesticide use now, and the need to be more, restrictive and aware of the risks. And I wanted people to understand the tort system and how, though it's very imperfect and many aspects of it can be exploitive, it also seems to be the only thing we have right now to hold companies accountable. And I want people to recognize the dangers that these companies are hiding from us. So a lot of messages in that book.
Okay, well, thank you very much, and thank you for writing this book and getting all this information out there so that the rest of us can see what's going on. So Hannah, we can turn this over now to look at some questions from the viewers here.
Yeah, it's time for our Q&A session. So you guys can type in questions to the Q&A feature available on the menu bar at the top of your window. We'll get to as many questions and comments as we can. And so feel free to start putting in your questions. We have a few already. And Jerry, I'll let you go ahead and start with some of our first questions.
Okay. So were there any consequences to any of the EPA employees that sort of were under the thumb of Monsanto? Did they get any repercussions from that?
Not that we know of. The only thing that we know of is that, Jess Rowland seemingly, from what we know, got a job with the chemical industry after he left EPA, got a job consulting with the chemical industry. The EPA did not want him deposed. Even though he had already left the agency, and these lawyers wanted to depose him, the EPA fought against that and they were only able to get very limited information from him.
Okay. So here's one. Aside from the $11 billion settlement, is there anything else that is being done to change their position or their practices to protect the harmful effects from glyphosate? That sounds like the answer to that is really no. They're just
Well,
continuing to move on, right?
well, I mean, it sort of is a no. Now, there are many countries and cities and, communities that are looking to ban glyphosate or taking a harder look at pesticide use now because of all the information that came out in the spotlight, that the trials and the documents and everything brought to light. Bayer has said, I mean, it's sort of, hanging on there a little bit, that they might be willing to put something on the label that maybe will point to information that people could go to about the science pertaining to cancer. But at this point, they're not willing to put a warning label or change the marketing in any way.
Do you think there's the possibility for FIFRA reform to help with pesticide regulations?
I don't know. I mean, let's hope so. Do we have a willing, White House and Congress at this point? I think it's encouraging that the Biden administration is set to, relook at a lot of decisions on chemicals, glyphosate, chlorpyrifos, dicamba. You're seeing that they're also talking that they want to be more protective of scientific integrity practices, because we know a lot of scientists in these agencies, EPA, USDA, and others, have frequently been censored when they try to share, research and opinions that runs counter to corporate interests. So yes, I mean, I think we need a lot of overhaul in Washington, D.C. So hopefully we can see something start with this new administration.
So here's kind of a scientific focused question,
Uh-oh.
and it has to do with how long does it take to develop cancer? And it seemed like that was a big question in the trial too.
Yeah.
Like Lee Johnson seemed to get it within a year or two, and Monsanto kept saying, no, it takes 20 years. And is there anything new on that at all?
Yeah, I mean, that latency was a big issue, certainly in the trials. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma, a lot of the science will say, maybe 20 years or more to develop. That was sort of, I think, the consensus or the general thought, that it would take this long from exposure, routine exposures, to develop this type of cancer. Lee Johnson did. I mean, his cancer was diagnosed, within a year or so, year and a half after his initial exposure. He then had a subsequent accident. He also had the routine exposure. But in his case, of course, he had an extraordinary exposure. He quite literally sort of jumped into this tank break of glyphosate, Roundup Ranger Pro, that was spraying everywhere and just got doused head to toe, and did not immediately, was not where he could shower or clean himself up or remove his clothing or anything like that. So, that was different, I suppose, than the most general types of exposure.
Okay, so this one is, are you hopeful the EU will step up and not renew the license for glyphosate? You know anything about that?
Well, I don't, again, people don't like it when I say this, I guess. I don't know that I don't really have a position on glyphosate by itself, because I think if you just address one chemical at a time, and if you ban glyphosate from agricultural use, say, are farmers then going to be using more paraquat, or are they going to be using more of something different? There's so many moving parts when it comes to pesticide regulation, and we think we need a bigger, more comprehensive package, I guess, of policy. So that I'm not for banning. I'm not against banning it. I'm just saying I think there's a lot of things that need to be taken into account. Looking at pesticides generally, glyphosate, chlorpyrifos, dicamba, 2,4-D, paraquat, all these things that are being used and that are in our food and that are harmful to our health. So So yes, I want them to take a hard look at it. I hope they do. I hope they recognize the science. I hope that people are aware of the risks, and that they can take more protective measures. I don't think it should be sprayed directly on food crops. I think that's insane. Not only for the residues that it leaves in the food, but the impacts on, biodiversity and the soil and the water and so there's a lot to unwrap in that question, I think.
So there's actually 25 people have commented, and a lot of them are just thanking you for the book and that they learned a lot from it. And some of them are very scientific questions and political kind of questions that maybe aren't the best
Oh, well,
for me to ask.
okay. Are we okay? I'm happy to take any questions. When I don't know stuff, I can quite easily say I don't know because I don't know a lot.
Do you think they should make a movie out of this?
Yeah.
Just like the other movie, Dark Waters, this would be the same kind of perfect thing.
Well, I gotta say, when I was reporting all this and watching it unfold, and I saw all the things that happened, like this tragic accident on this eve of trial, and this, just sort of all these crazy things that were happening, I thought it's got to be a movie. It just has to be a movie. And of course, I can't make a movie, so I wrote a book. But yeah, it would be a fun movie, I think, or an important movie. I shouldn't say fun, important.
Okay, I'm looking to see if there's any quick. This person just has a comment that they work for the Farm Worker Association of Florida, and they work on pesticide health and safety. And they found many long-term consequences to farm workers from chronic pesticide exposure.
Yes.
And they think part of the problem is the cozy relationship between the agricultural agrochemical industry and the EPA. And in order to do something, we need to fix that. And I think that's something that you've always already said.
Yeah, quite definitely, quite definitely. I mean, the I'll just mention this quickly. In the internal Monsanto documents, you see that their own people, when they're spraying these chemicals, they warn them to, wear all this protective gear, be sure you go through all of these protocols. But then you see them advertising these chemicals on television, and you see people in shorts and flip-flops or tennis shoes or whatever with no gloves, no respirator, just spraying at will. So it's a different message internally than it is to the rest of the world.
Okay, Carey, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. It was terrific.
Thanks for having me.
And I'll turn it back now to Hannah.
Great. Thank you so much, Carey and Jerry. If you would like to learn more, you can purchase the book using a discount code, as I mentioned, offering a 30% discount. The link to purchase the book is on our webinar webpage under slides and resources, and the discount code is webinar, all capitals. With that, we are approaching the end of today's webinar. A video recording will be available on Che's website soon, and tomorrow you'll receive an email containing a link to the video. Our next Che Alaska Partnership webinar will take place on Wednesday, April 28th, and is titled Protecting Your Child's Health with Ruth Etzel. Then on May 11th, we will host our next Che EDC Strategies Partnership webinar featuring Dimitri Abrahamson and Tracy Woodruff presenting their new study, Suspect Screening, Prioritization and Confirmation of Environmental Chemicals in Maternal Newborn Pairs from San Francisco. You can find details soon on our website at healthandenvironment.org. If you're new to Che and would like to stay updated about upcoming events or more, please sign up to receive our newsletter by selecting the Join Us tab at the top of any page on our website at healthandenvironment.org. Additionally, if you appreciate these Che Partnership webinars bringing you the latest environmental health research for free, we encourage you to support Che's ongoing work by making a tax-deductible donation via our secure website. Again, our website is healthandenvironment.org. With that, I would like to thank our speaker, Carey Gillam. Thank you so much for joining us today and presenting your important work and your book. And to you, Jerry, thank you for your excellent moderation. Thank you both. We're wishing everyone much health and wellness. Take care and have a great day.